All right, happy Friday. I'm sure you're glad to get a few days of rest this weekend. Just one more video for the week, obviously, today. And then we will be able to finish the story of World War One tomorrow. There's a few things we're leaving out. Like yesterday, we were talking about efforts to try to break the stalemate on the Western Front. And I didn't tell you about one of the major British efforts called Gallipoli. Um, but we've got to make decisions about what we can include and what we can't include. Just needless to say, I'm trying to follow a storyline, but there's pieces of the puzzle that we won't necessarily get to. I'm pretty sure we won't say much about the Russian Revolution, for instance. But yesterday, what we were talking about were these battles where the goal was to break the stalemate, and the German effort at Verdun was followed by a British effort at the Somme, and both were unsuccessful in many ways, although the Germans did cause the casualties they were looking for. But what we were saying at the very end of the video yesterday was this, that the British really had been courting or recruiting the United States to join the war on the side of the Allies. And they viewed that as a major advantage of theirs. If they could get the Americans on their side, they felt like they could break the stalemate. And so that kind of recruiting was going on. Now, I want to talk about reasons why the United States was staying neutral at first, and I've simplified them um, to a significant degree, but they're good enough for our situation. So, reasons for neutrality here. Um, let's just kind of take them in turn. The first one that I have listed here is divided loyalties. Here's what I mean. There were people in the United States that, you know, could trace their heritage back to all of the different countries that were represented in World War One. By this time, there were immigrants that were from Southern and Eastern Europe. By this time, there were, of course, immigrants who had been in the country for a long time from Germany, uh, from Ireland and England, France, all of that. So it was sort of unclear as to where the American, sort of posture would take them, where their loyalties lie. In particular, that's true because the American government had um, connections to a lot of these countries too. Um, and this meant that it was not necessarily clear which side they would be on if they did join the war. Now that's kind of hard to believe because of how strongly public opinion swayed by the end of the war. But that public opinion was swayed for a reason, and we'll look at that reason in a few minutes here. But at the time the war started, there were 8 million people in the United States that considered themselves German Americans. And the 8 million might not sound like much to you. That's like New York City or something. But you have to remember that the population at the time was much, much lower, less than half of what we have now. So the percentage, 8 million, was like almost 8% of the population. That's a significant number. So World War One starts, and there's not necessarily a bad guy. Some people have painted Germany that way because of their aggression through the Schlieffen Plan. Um, but really, early on, it just seemed like, well, these are European countries fighting one another, and uh, what are we going to do about it? And part of the reason for that is their isolationist tendencies in the United States at the time. The 20th century is really interesting as you sort of see the American pendulum swing back and forth between isolationism and interventionism. Isolationism is just the idea that basically says, let's take care of America first. Let's only worry about what's going on here. Let's not worry about what's going on in the rest of the world. Now, the United States had actually started um, the 20th century intervening in Latin America and also in the Philippines. But by the time World War One rolls around, many Americans were feeling very happy about the fact that the ocean separated them from what was going on over in Europe. And the American economy was going pretty well. And so many Americans thought, listen, the problem's over there. Let's just leave it over there. It's not our problem. It's way over there. Now that's going to shift as time goes on, and I'll try to explain why. But that isolationist tendency is important because there wasn't really any public pressure to join the war, especially at first. Third, the president at the time was a man named Woodrow Wilson, who was an academic. He was an academic at Princeton and then governor of New Jersey after that. And he tended towards diplomacy. You might be able to say pacifism, but that's probably a little bit strong for the decisions that he makes later, obviously to join the war. But his initial posture was he didn't want to be involved in war. He actually said uh, early on in the war, there's such a thing as being too proud to fight. Um, he he campaigned for re-election in 1916 under the slogan that he kept us out of the war. You could see that he was painting this picture of saying, listen, my strength as a leader is that I'm avoiding the trouble. I'm not getting us into this mess. So his leadership does lean in the direction of avoiding the conflict. In fact, there were people in his cabinet, including his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, who were also very, very interested in avoiding World War I. In fact, William Jennings Bryan will actually resign from the cabinet when the United States decided to join the war. That's how opposed to the war effort he was. The last one I want to list, although it's not the last one that there actually is, but the last one I want to list is business interests. Early on, American businessmen thought, you know what? If this war is, going to consume Europe, they're going to need our production, our ability to produce, wheat, our ability to produce meat, our ability to produce even weapons. And so many businessmen were lobbying to stay out of the war because they thought, okay, well, we can trade with both sides. We could trade with the Central Powers and the Allies, and we'll make a lot of money that way because they're both going to need the food that we could produce and the manufactured goods that we could produce and even the weapons. So for the first essentially 3 years of the war, just a little bit, if you count it by months, it's actually about 3 years, but it's by calendar years goes from 1914 to really 1918 before America's involved. But what's going to happen is there's going to be a shift. Reasons to join. Probably the most famous reason is this. It's called unrestricted submarine warfare. What we mean by that is that the Germans had a strategy. They were trying to blockade England, and they were also actually sort of indiscriminately sinking ships in the Atlantic Ocean that were headed to England with supplies, especially military supplies. And there were American ships that got sunk eventually. There were also ships that had Americans on them that got sunk. Now, this is a really sort of hazy area, almost a gray area, because what was happening is the British were using what were normally passenger ships to actually ship or bring over weapons from the United States. The most famous incident by far is what's called the Lusitania. The Lusitania was basically a cruise ship, a passenger ship, but they were carrying weapons as well as civilians over to England. And it's really an interesting story in a lot of ways, and a frustrating story, because actually the Germans had taken out a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, listen, you should not ride on this ship. You should not be riding on British passenger vessels because we are intending to attack them. And many Americans sort of waved their hands at that threat. They thought, oh, that will never happen. In this case, the Lusitania, it seems, was actually exposed to German fire by the British leadership. that they knew that the Lusitania was vulnerable and in danger and didn't take the necessary precautions to keep it safe, and sort of exposed it to a U-boat that was operating in the channel, and it led to it being sunk, and it went down very, very quickly, and thousands of people were killed, including Americans. So a lot of Americans were very upset about that, including the other ships that had been sunk by the Germans. There had been for a minute, I don't mean that literally, there had been for a short amount of time what was called the Sussex Pledge, where basically Woodrow Wilson forced the Germans to promise that they would stop sinking ships that had Americans and American vessels in the Atlantic. One of the ships had been Sussex, and that's why it's called the Sussex Pledge. But the Germans took a calculated gamble and basically thought, if we try to win the war right now, we might be able to do it before the Americans joined. So they opened up unrestricted submarine warfare. A second reason I have here is sort of twofold. One is Allied propaganda. The British worked very hard at painting the Germans as the bad guys, and the French too, and it became pretty effective. And there was some information that they were working with that was accurate, some of the actions of German soldiers, and they were playing off of the fact that the Germans were the first to attack with the Schlieffen Plan and so forth. But their propaganda became very, very effective, and public opinion in the United States swayed towards the Allies pretty quickly. One of the sort of final nails in that coffin was what's called the Zimmermann Notes, or the Zimmermann Telegram. Basically, a German statesman, politician, had tried to get in contact with the Mexican government and basically said, listen, if you guys cause trouble for the United States and distract them from the war, provoke the United States into conflict with you, then what we'll do is, take care of you after the war is over. They wanted Mexico to distract us. And actually, we were embroiled with some conflict in Mexico in the years leading to our involvement in World War I, especially because of a man named Pancho Villa, who was a Mexican rebel who was, he was actually murdering Americans along the border and in Mexico and even in the United States. So this Zimmermann Notes was found by the British, and they showed it to the American government and said, look what the Germans are trying to do. So that was one of the pieces of the puzzle. Another thing here is business interests. The business interest sort of shifts. It becomes obvious that it's impossible to trade with both sides, especially during the blockade efforts. So what happened then is that American companies and American businessmen became very heavily invested in the Allied countries, invested in their victory. If they were giving so much money to the Allies and so many goods that they said, basically, if the Allies don't win, we'll never get our money back. So there came to be business interests in Allied victory. And eventually, American businessmen would become very involved in Europe after the war. But the business interest thing shifts. Basically, bottom line is Americans became invested in Allied victory. And then the last shift I want to talk about is Woodrow Wilson. Remember, he talked about being too proud to fight and being more diplomatic or almost pacifist. He campaigns for re-election on the slogan that he kept us out of the war, but he's going to shift. And what he's going to shift is to a phrase that becomes very famous. He wants to make the world safe for democracy. Wants to make the world safe for democracy. He begins to see World War I basically as an opportunity to be involved in the peace process and to the arrangement of the peace treaty and the later international agreements that he thinks will make it possible to rearrange the way the world functions. And his biggest dream is to create a League of Nations following World War I. He wants to create this international governing body that will prevent future wars. They start to call World War I the war to end all wars, meaning when we win this war, we'll be able to arrange the peace in such a way that we'll never need a war again. Now that becomes sort of ironic because World War I very clearly causes World War II in many, many ways. But Woodrow Wilson's idea shifts. He wants to get involved because he wants to be involved in the peace process. And of course, America will get involved. And we'll talk about that on Monday.